Hello and welcome to our first lecture in environmental studies. Over the course of this semester, we're going to learn about many different environmental topics. We're going to talk about environmental disasters, we're going to talk about environmental science, we're going to talk about different shareholders. However, before we get into that, I think it's important that we talk about the history of environmental studies. It's only within the last 200 years or so that people have really put a focus on our impacts on the environment. And I think it's important to understand where we came from in order to know where we're going. So with that said, we're going to do a brief lecture on the history of environmental studies. Over the course of this PowerPoint, we're going to talk about different types of terms that come up during environmental studies. We're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution, and we're going to talk about some famous individuals that brought environmental studies into the public's conscious, such as John Muir and Rachel Carson. We're going to talk about legislation that impacts environmental laws, and also end on what are called environmental hotspots. So let's begin, shall we? So before we begin, we're going to talk about a few terms, and you've probably heard these terms before, but it's important that we define them. A biologist is a scientist who studies living organisms. Biologists can study humans, plants, fungus, health, etc. Basically, biologists study living organisms, so as long as it's alive, it can fit under the category of a biologist. An ecologist studies the relationship between living organisms and their environment. But ecologists study interactions between the living and non-living environment, such as algae and nutrient concentrations within a lake, for example. An environmentalist is someone who works to protect the environment from destruction or pollution. A conservationist is a person who maintains areas of land for protection either for the land itself or because of a threatened species. And a naturalist is someone who studies the natural world, mostly through observation and not experimentation. So even though these definitions may sound very similar, such as an environmentalist and an ecologist, they are two distinct different types of careers. Some ecologists may be environmentalists, and some environmentalists may be ecologists. However, not all ecologists would consider themselves environmentalists. Terms carry significance with them. Scientists strive to be impartial within their studies. Connotations such as an environmentalist or conservationist imply that there may be a bias or a hidden agenda that needs to be advanced. I'm not saying this agenda may be a bad thing per se. However, scientists, as we mentioned, tend to be more impartial and let the facts speak for themselves. Now, with the terms out of the way, let's get on to the history of environmental studies. I promise I won't bore you too much. During the early 1700s, wind and water was used as energy for mills, and were the main sources of energy. Horses and oxen were used to travel and farm the land. However, after the 1700s, the Industrial Revolution began. The Industrial Revolution was a period within the 18th and 19th centuries, such as where changes in agricultural, manufacturing, and mining occurred. Many industries relied heavily on steam produced through wood and coal, and were moving away from water and wind energy. The Industrial Revolution is also characterized as a period of increased wages, jobs, and population growth. On the picture on the left there, you can see a picture of the Allegheny Portage Railroad, which you can still visit some of the sites nearby. The Industrial Revolution started in the mid-1700s. As you can see on the graph on the slide here, you can see that there was a huge increase in population within that time frame. During this time, coal and wood replaced wind and water as a source for industrial advancement. Another thing to note during this time period is that human population increased as well as life expectancy. However, the Industrial Revolution came with a cost to the environment. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, there was increased carbon dioxide within the atmosphere, increased mercury within the atmosphere and water, and forests and rivers were destroyed and contaminated for the industrial advancement. Deforestation also occurred within the United States. Deforestation is defined as the conversion of forest to another land use, such as urban and agriculture. Since the 1600s, 90% of primary forests have been logged within the United States. And you can see the picture here on the right of the United States forest in the 1600s and how it decreased between the 1600s to the 1800s to the 1900s. As the Industrial Revolution continued into the early 1900s, the American frontier has been settled. Large tracts of America have been exploited via deforestation, coal mines, and overfarming. The picture on the top here is a picture from what is called the Hughes borehole, which is found within Portage, Pennsylvania. Underneath the ground here is a mine that flooded after it was abandoned, and it's a site of contamination. And if you ever go to it, it kind of looks like the surface of Mars. You can see there's no trees or anything living within the surrounding area that's impacted. So during the early 1900s, individuals were noticing that the environment was being impacted for the advancement of industry. So some individuals decided that land should be set aside to be conserved. Yellowstone was established in 1872 as the first national park, and then Yosemite National Park was officially established in 1906. The idea of these parks was to be established was to preserve for the public to enjoy for future generations. In 1909, President Theodore Roosevelt established over 42 million acres of national forest by the end of his term. And again, this was due to individuals realizing that land was starting to disappear. In my next talk, I'm going to talk about environmental disasters that helped shape the way and pave the way for legislation within the United States for environmental policies. However, during the early 1900s, for lack of a better term, there was many environmental bummers, as I like to call them. During the 1900s, individuals were realizing that the surrounding land was becoming more and more polluted. Smoke from industry was making cloudy skies within St. Louis, New York, Chicago, and Johnstown, PA. Abandoned coal mines were being left behind, and this added to environmental degradation. Back in the early 1900s, coal mines were, after coal mine went out of business, they were allowed just to be abandoned. Also, large swaths of land in the northeast have been completely ravished for the progress of industrial advancement, and many forests have been torn down. An individual by the name of John Muir is considered one of the first naturalists within the United States. He was born in Scotland, and his family immigrated to the United States when he was young. As a young adult, he moved to the Yosemite area. And Muir was a naturalist and made many observations within the Sierra Mountains. On the right there is a picture of John Muir, and he can be found on the California state quarter. John Muir believed that humans were a part of nature rather than its ruler. He wrote many essays about his thoughts on nature, one called Man's Place Within the Universe, which was read by the public. And this started to form within the public conscious that humans are not a part of nature, or rather, they belong to nature. John Muir also helped found the Sierra Club, which is an environmental organization that does conservation work. He believed that nature is our home, and he helped push for the protection and conservation of land. John Muir was also friends with Teddy Roosevelt. and he helped him to start the national park system. You can see a picture of Mr. Muir with President Roosevelt on the right. Muir convinced President Roosevelt that nature should be preserved, and he inspires many conservationists today with his writings and his contributions. Next individual I want to talk about is Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was born right here in Pennsylvania, in Springdale, PA, which is pretty close to Pittsburgh. Rachel Carson studied marine biology and zoology at Penn College and Woods Hole. She wrote pamphlets, books on conservation, natural resources, and on the ocean. After World War II, Rachel Carson was disturbed by the widespread use of pesticides and their long-term effects on the environment. She based many of her observations on birds dying after the use of the pesticide DDT, and Rachel Carson concluded that it should be banned. Rachel Carson wrote a book in 1962 called Silent Spring, and this book was about her observations about how birds were disappearing due to the use of pesticides. Carson believed that chemicals need to be used sparingly in nature, and she urged the public to question authority. She asked questions about what gives humans rights to destroy nature, and she didn't think that dominating nature was the correct course for humans' future. Due to the work of John Muir, and more importantly, Rachel Carson in the 1960s, helped to raise awareness for environmental issues. Due to these environmental issues being raised, environmental laws were then passed. The purpose of laws were to protect and conserve nature and its resources for future generations. The Clean Water Act was passed in the 60s, and the idea of the Clean Water Act is to maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our nation's water by preventing point and non-point pollution sources. The Clean Air Act was passed in 1972, and its purpose was to protect and enhance quality of the nation's air resources, and initiate a national research program. It set standards for acid rain, smog, and other air pollution. Part of the Clean Air Act is to monitor the air. And throughout the United States, there are what are called air monitoring stations. The purpose of these is to collect rainfall, and the water collected from these buckets then goes to labs to be analyzed. The purpose of this is to monitor the air quality. Another thing that came out with passing these laws was protecting biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety of life found within an ecosystem or habitat. Protecting the environment protects organisms within these habitats. Scientists have identified throughout the world what are called hotspots. A hotspot is an area where species that are endemic, that are native, are disappearing at a rapid rate. Red areas on the map here are hotspots. So there are hotspots found within the rainforest, hotspots found within the west coast of the United States, some within Mexico, and parts of Asia. And these are areas where nature is being destroyed and it's threatening species found within these environments. As we're going to learn about over the course of the semester, it can be hard to put a value on biodiversity. One case study was done within New York City's watershed. 90% of 9 million people's water comes from the Catskill Mountains and Delaware River that supply New York City. New York City had a slight dilemma on their hands in order to provide clean drinking water to them. They could either protect functioning ecosystems or construct filtration plants. To build these water filtration plants cost about $6 billion. with an annual operating cost of $300 million a year. Or they could spend $1 billion over 10 years to preserve these ecosystems. So scientists figured that it was cheaper to preserve surrounding ecosystems to these watersheds than building these filtration plants. This map on this slide is just illustrating watersheds that supply New York City with water from the Catskill Delaware watersheds. And again, we're going to see this problem come up a couple times over the course of the semester. How do you put a value on biodiversity? Well, there's a couple problems with valuing ecosystems. It's hard to have a good estimate of the monetary value of services provided by ecosystems. People who gain the benefits of environmental degradation are often not the same people who pay the cost. For instance, individuals that may tear down a part of forest aren't necessarily the people that live in that area. However, they may gain the monetary cost. Also, ethical and aesthetic values are based on our conscience. Every species has a value of its own. Humans should act as guardians or stewards for the diversity of life around us. But how do we place a value on beauty? And what if that organism or species is endangered, threatened, or no longer exists? These are all questions one must ask themselves when trying to value biodiversity. There are several factors that are responsible for the loss of biodiversity and can cause animals to go extinct. Overexploitation, habitat loss, introduced species such as invasive species, disruption of ecosystem interactions, pollution, loss of genetic variation, and catastrophic disturbances. All these factors that are responsible for the loss of biodiversity will go over a little more detail over the course of this semester. So what is the future of the environment? Well, good news is people have much more sense of the environment now than they did in the 1800s and 1900s. Also, humans realize that our actions do have consequences. So we're going to cover many of these themes and more within this class. On that note, I'd just like to add a few fun facts about the United States. The United States has a total landmass of about 3,717 square miles, give or take a few thousand. And it's the fourth largest country by landmass within the world. So long story short, the United States has a lot of land. And, as we see here, a lot of parks. There are about 400 national parks throughout the United States. And some national parks are actually local, such as the Allegheny Portage Railroad that I talked about previously. And Pennsylvania alone has 116 state parks. So, if nothing else from this course, hopefully you guys do get the travel bug and want to visit a national park or a state park. Alright, well that concludes our talk. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.